it's important to note that our story doesn't begin or end here. It's part of a massive sprawling campaign that stretches the better part of 100 days, 4 months straight, as the Union forces are driving the Confederates down through the North Georgia area down to Atlanta, Georgia, and even beyond if you really want to think about it. And this is just one of several different things that are happening. And it's important, this is where I get into my boring history lesson before we actually get the walk started, in setting up some context and knowing what's going on. So basically, our story begins in the year 1864. Can one of you guys really smart or have been to another program tell me when the Civil War began?
1861.
61, yeah. So we're like in, as Jake likes to put it, like season 3 or 4 of the Civil War. So there's been a lot that's happened previous to set up the stage here. Essentially, the most important thing is on the political stage, right? By this point in the war, as you get into the second half of the Civil War, you can also you can imagine already that there's several 100,000 killed, wounded, and captured on either side. This has been an incredibly traumatic experience for this nation. By the end of the war, just to give you an idea, about 2% of the American population will be dead in 4 years, right? So this wasn't something where I know somebody who knows somebody who is related to somebody that didn't make it through. This is somebody close to me is deeply affected by this war in one way or the other. Again, it is a civil conflict raging throughout the eastern portion of the United States as we know it today. And so there was not a stone that was left unturned when it came to this war. And a lot of that is being blamed on one person in particular. Can you guess who that might be?
Abraham Lincoln.
Lincoln, yeah, as the president of the United States. And a lot of people are kind of blaming him for drawing us into this conflict and also for the longevity of the conflict, how long it's been going on, how much it's raged. As you can imagine, if you know much about the Civil War and the Union forces for the first couple of years, they went through a lot of different commanders, right? There was this constant kind of open door, rotating door of these Napoleonic figures rising up to the occasion and then being crushed, and then being replaced, rising up, crushed. And so they really haven't found their person yet that can do much real damage to the Confederacy. And it's gotten so bad, in fact, that the Confederates under Robert E. Lee just this past summer in 1863 have launched an invasion into federal territory, basically ending with the Confederate defeat at Gettysburg. But still, I mean, that's huge, right? But the Confederates are now up there doing things. And so all of this is being blamed on Lincoln. And wouldn't you know it, as we get into the year 1864, what happens every 4 years in our great nation? We just went through it not too long ago. Yes, presidential election, everybody's favorite time of the year, right? But without those annoying commercials, I'm sure, back then. But a lot is on the line here politically, and Lincoln himself believes he's going to be defeated in the coming presidential election. His own Republican Party are saying things like, if we run with Lincoln, we're going to be defeated, so we got to find somebody else. And he actually has a note written that's in his desk, basically break glass in case of emergency, basically saying, I'm going to drop out of the presidential race, right, if the war doesn't take a drastic turn. And the Democrats running against Lincoln at this point are running more or less on a platform of negotiated peace with the Confederacy. So a cessation to hostilities, going back to the drawing board and trying to work this thing out without a whole lot of bloodshed, which is looking pretty good to the average American, right? And so Lincoln going into this thing, he's thinking, well, that would involve capitulation of one sort or another, right? At its most extreme, it could even mean recognition as a sovereign nation for the Confederacy, which is not necessarily something that they want. And so he is thinking, well, the only way to truly win the war is to have a great military victory, have success in the coming election, and then at that point, the dominoes can kind of fall from there, right? The American people can see that the war can be won and that there doesn't need to be a capitulation to the Confederates, and then we'll see what happens. And so going into 1864, there's a lot that's kind of changed. The balance has definitely shifted more in the favor of the Union Army, but again, it might be too little and too late. In 1863, the summer of 1863, we have two major defeats for Confederate forces. We have the Confederate defeat at Gettysburg, as I mentioned before, so that is a great blow to the morale of the Confederacy. And then logistically, the Union Army has captured the port city of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River, which has opened up that whole river to Union trade, and it's cut the Confederacy into two parts. Now, to make things even worse for them, they've been driven out of Tennessee in the late fall, thanks to Ulysses S. Grant capturing the city, having Chattanooga, and then driving them from the area of Chattanooga down into North Georgia. So things aren't necessarily looking that great for the Confederates. But again, how's that going to stand in the court of public opinion when it comes to the vote, right? And so going into 1864, Lincoln is going to find a general who is going to be the perfect person to try and get this done. And that, of course, is going to be Ulysses S. Grant. And Ulysses S. Grant is one of the greatest military minds, in my opinion, that this country has produced. For the first couple years of the war, I mentioned Union Army's not doing too terribly well. That's different, right? Grant has more or less been able to secure victory after victory for the Union forces throughout the first couple years of the war. He was the one that captured Fort Donelson. He captured victory out of the jaws of defeat at Shiloh. He was the one that captured Vicksburg. He was the one that broke the siege of Chattanooga and drove the Confederates down into North Georgia. So this is the guy for Lincoln to come up with a military way of solving this problem. So while he is going to be coming up with a plan and leading his armies against Lee up near the Confederate capital of Richmond, he's going to entrust a very, very critical part of his plan to his best friend, this charming individual right here. We all know him, William T. Sherman. Yep. So Sherman is not the commander of an army. He is the commander of 3 armies. So we have 3 massive forces, 110,000 strong on paper at least, that are going to be launching what is essentially an invasion into the Confederacy through that corridor of railroad passages, which is right now I-75, without the traffic, otherwise he'd still be there. But making his way down towards Atlanta. And that's really important. His goal basically is to capture the means of production for the Confederates, right? To extinguish that fire in their belly so that they can't wage this war as Grant is fighting Lee up near the capitals. And again, the bullseye is on the city of Atlanta, but also there is a time crunch because this has to be done before the elections in November. So there's a lot at stake here. And coming against him, or standing in his way essentially, is a Confederate force of about 70,000 strong at its highest point, again on paper, led by this gentleman here, General Joseph E. Johnston. And that is the Confederate Army of Tennessee. And after the war, there's going to be a lot of blame put on Johnston and on another guy named John Bell Hood for what ends up happening to this army. And with Atlanta, spoiler alert, as we all know, the Union does end up capturing it. And a lot of the blame is put on the lack of resources, the lack of manpower. The Confederate government is urging Johnston to do something radical to drive Sherman out of Georgia and out of Tennessee, but he's outnumbered by all of these Union forces. Turns out 70,000 strong, that's a big deal. That's the largest army that the Confederacy will ever field during the entirety of the war. So they are trying to give him the resources to make this work, right? But there's also a conflict of personalities here. Johnston is not a very aggressive commander. He is a very defensive-minded person. He loses a lot of ground. And in his mind, he's thinking, well, with these outstanding forces that Sherman has, I need to draw him into some kind of trap that I can spring on him, and then I can destroy his forces in piecemeal. Whereas, again, the Confederates are like, no, you need to take the initiative, do something drastic, like Lee would. He's always compared to Lee, right? And drive him out of Georgia. So that sets the stage for the campaign and the battle that happens here. The Atlanta campaign begins in early May of 1864, and without getting into the weeds too much, it is basically just a slog through trenches, through the Georgia wilderness. It is pretty awful when you look into the experiences of the average soldier, which we'll be doing today. And again, this is just one snapshot of a whole bunch of battles that are happening during that 4-month time. In fact, if you look back on some of the primary sources, they even describe the Atlanta campaign as the 100 days battle, because a lot of these units are just under constant fire non-stop for 4 months straight. But they raged through the North Georgia area, for the better part of 6 weeks. In that time, Sherman has driven the Confederates through 8 different defensive lines until you get to this 9th one that we call the Kennesaw line. And when I say defensive line, I'm not talking about a couple hundred yards, right? The Kennesaw line itself is a formidable 12-mile-long series of trenches and earthworks that start near where I-75 is today. They go up and over all 3 peaks of Kennesaw Mountain, where we're at now, past where we're going to be talking about, down towards Cheatham Hill off of Dallas Highway, past that area, all the way down past where the Coles Farm is, and eventually terminates around where the fairgrounds are today. So this is a massive endeavor, and you have to imagine this is the 9th one that these Confederates have dug in 6 weeks. So just to give you an idea of the nature of the campaign. Now, to make matters even more complicated, it is bad weather. The kind of weather that we had this last summer in Georgia was historically accurate. Samuel French, which we'll talk about in a minute, but he was up on Little Kennesaw. He was a Confederate general. After the war, he writes a memoir, and he describes it by saying that it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and the ark came to rest on the Kennesaw Heights. Just to give you an idea, it was biblical the amount of rainfall they had. So there, the rain, the mud, the clay, right, all of it's together, humidity, the heat.
What month was this?
So this is from May, and we're going to be talking about middle of June of 1864. So the Confederates fall into the Kennesaw line on June 14th, June 19th, 1864, and originally Sherman thinks that he's got them on the run. He's got them past the Chattahoochee River, and as he approaches this area, he sees them hard at work on top of Kennesaw Mountain, and the first thing he says, it's a bit of a masked slip here, is he says, "My God, Johnson's turned this whole place into one vast fort. What is he going to do about it?" Right? Well, he does have a plan. What he's been doing throughout this campaign is he will grab hold of the Confederates with one hand and move around them with the other. And that's what he's going to try to do here. He begins to send men up the Powder Springs Road, which is about 5 miles south of us here. They get stopped there by a very aggressive Confederate commander by the name of John Bell Hood. We get the Battle of Coles Farm. Not going to get into the weeds with that too much, but it basically stops the Union advance at that point. And that's on the 22nd of June, 1864. So he says, well, what do I do? Can't go around them. What do you think? Go through them. Yep. So he's going to do something that's unexpected, but in his mind, he is thinking, well, if Johnston doesn't want to give me the right of way, if he wants to play the game here, we're going to play it here. And again, that time crunch. There's a lot of that going on here. He realizes that he hasn't even made it to the city yet. It's already June. He's already been through 2 or 3 different sieges, massive sieges of cities during this war, and they take a long time, right, to capture a city, and he hasn't even gotten there yet. And this all has to be done before November. So that leads to some of these rash actions, which actually will not be repeated later on. So, planning for the battle, you're going to have diversionary attacks far to the north, where the mountain is at, where the visitor center is at, to keep the Confederates there in entanglement. You're going to have what ends up becoming a reconnaissance by force down far to the south, past where the Coles Farmhouse is. We'll come back to that in a minute because it's very important to the way this battle develops. But then the 2 massive hammer blows are going to be to these major roads that we have going through the park today, going towards Marietta. So right here on the Hickory Road, this was once a historic road going into the historic city of Marietta. You're going to have Federal soldiers, about 5,500 of them from 3 brigades, that are going to try to break through at this point. And then just a couple miles down the road, you're going to have the fighting down there at Cheatham Hill, which is the largest scale fighting with the costliest amount of casualties during what we call the actual Battle of Kennesaw Mountain on June 27, 1864. Well, we're really going to be concentrating on this little section of the battlefield. There's a lot of really interesting things that happen just right here. And so we'll get into that. The first thing that we're going to do is we're just going to walk out towards that open field. There's a little sign you can see out kind of back there, and we'll talk about the fighting that happened in this open field. It's easy here because there was 3 brigades and they were all doing kind of different things to be able to break the battle down like that, one brigade to the next. And then we're going to cross over the road and then go up the hill itself. So just a couple of safety things before we get started. Obviously, we're going to be crossing that road. We're going to use the crosswalk and the lighted crosswalk there. They usually stop if they see one of us. So We'll see. But even so, we're going to all cross in one group, and we're going to try to make it as least amount of danger as possible. Now, the trail itself is pretty steep, so this isn't going to be a death march. We're going to go as fast as the slowest person. It's exposed, right? So it's not going to be paved. So just be aware that there's rocks, especially we're going up a rocky slope there, and as well as leaf coverage and exposed tree roots. There's a lot of tripping hazards, and be mindful of people and their dogs, right? That's another big thing. Does anybody have any questions or anything before we actually? Cool.
You were talking about the Union coming down to kind of break through the road.
Yep.
Well, could you describe briefly the Confederates on both sides of the road kind of holding it? Is that what?
Yeah, so when we go up the hill itself, we'll actually see the remnants of the earthworks on top of the hill there. But they stretched, again, starting at I-75 all the way over here, and then it crosses the road, and just where the wood line is where the main line continues on past. And set ahead of that main line is what we call a picket line, which is a series of what we would describe now as hasty fighting positions or foxholes. Back then it was called a rifle pit.
And then that would be the Confederates.
Yeah, the Confederates.
Further behind the tree line there.
Yep, so the rifle pits originally were right here, basically along this opposite tree line, and that's what we're going to be talking about first.
Oh, okay.
The Union forces came basically from, if we're facing this way, they came straight at us. So this is the Confederate perspective. They came straight at us. There was one brigade that peeled around and turned and tried to rush across this open field. The other two were north of the road. One of them tried to go up the western slope, and the other one ended up funneled into a gorge between Pigeon Hill and Little Kennesaw. So
they came from this direction. What beyond here? Where did they originate?
So they just continued along this road, basically from there's some fighting down at the Mud Creek line, and then beyond that there's Dallas. So continuing along these major roads.
Which way direction? Northwest.
So this is north. The mountain more or less runs north-south. So this is north, south, and then west and east. Marietta being about 2.5 miles to our east. Any other questions or anything?
So you talked about this being the 9th defensive line. Just to put that in perspective, can you name some of the other 8?
Yeah, so I mean the very first one, Rocky Face Ridge. Then you had some fighting around Resaca. Then you had some stuff over in Adairsville, Cassville. And then you had pretty massive, extensive fighting in Dallas. And that's going to come into play later when it comes to kind of why Sherman decided to do what he did here instead of just, why don't you just go wide around them?
Yeah.
And then, you know the story of Dallas, of the fighting there?
No, but that's my question. Just why mess with this mountain at all? Just go around it.
Yeah, and so then you have the Brushy Mountain line, the Mud Creek line, and then Kennesaw Mountain. So, and when we get into this portion of the fighting, we have a pretty established line here at Kennesaw, but for about a week or so prior to this, what's happening is the Confederate line is like folding in on itself. So they'll establish a line, and then they'll kind of fold it back, and they'll fold it back, and then eventually it became the Kennesaw Mountain line.
Are there parks on the other 8 lines?
There's nothing that's run by the National Park Service.
Any state parks?
There's some state parks. We have Pickett's Mill over in Dallas, and then over near where the Battle of New Hope Church happened, which is near Dallas, we've got there's a little satellite park there where they have some earthworks that are preserved. The cemetery where the Confederates fought, the Rails and the Hellhole, that's all mostly preserved. But really you just have like local parks, or really besides Pickett's Mill and this one here, we really don't have anything that's majorly protected or preserved at this point. Which is sad, but
Well, thank you.
yeah. Any other
They
questions?
came down from Chattanooga.
They did. Yep.
All right. Then how'd they wind up here?
Because they're following, because it's 3 armies and they split them up into wings. But you can't just have one army follow 75, which is the railroad line all the way down, right? They take these major roads to end up in these places. So, and then it's almost like it is one continual fight, but you can think of each of these little towns that they pass through as like chapters in that fight. And so they get to a town, they find a major road around it or through it, and then they try to attack. They build fortifications, they defend it, and then. Does that answer your question, kind of? So think of it as I mean, it's trench warfare at this point. Fighting has devolved almost completely into what we would think of as World War I style trench warfare without machine guns. You know, they had cannons basically, which were in the role of the machine guns, but same thing. You've got constant artillery fire back and forth, constant skirmishing back and forth, lots of sharpshooter fire back and forth, and it really is just a slog as they move an inch, move an inch, move an inch. All right, maybe not as slow as the trench warfare actually in World War One, but it's basically the same. You have no man's land in the middle, and then these two sides that are vying for control of that area. So, any other questions or anything? Cool, awesome. So let's get on out that. Why Kennesaw Mountain? Why was this so important? Why was Sherman so angry about all of this? And the fact of the matter is, when the Confederates dug into Kennesaw Mountain, one of the first things they did was they dragged artillery pieces up to the top of the mountain. We'll explore that here in a little bit as well. But that mountain is really, really close to the railroad line that Sherman was dependent on to get his supplies, basically from Nashville down through Chattanooga and wherever he was at along the campaign route. And so the Confederates developed a stranglehold on that supply line. And Sherman needed about 100 railroad cars every day full of supplies just to keep this thing moving. And so that immediately irked him. And yeah, we'll get into that here in a minute when we actually get up to the hill itself. There's actually a pretty interesting story about some of the cannon firing back and forth. But that's kind of why this was as important to him as it was. And also, the reason why he didn't just decide to give his men 10 days worth of rations and swing around right on the outset is because that's what happened at Dallas. The Confederates had established a trap for him through a railroad pass in the Allatoona Mountains, just northwest of here. And he realized that was happening, so he gave his men 10 days worth of rations. He had them swing off of his supply line, and the Confederates basically sidestepped, got in his way immediately. And we get the battles around Dallas, and they were very costly for Union forces. The Union forces lost 2 of the 3 battles down near Dallas, Georgia. And that was just recently. That was just at the end of May. So I'm thinking that he probably didn't want to have a repeat of that, and he didn't want to become too dependent on a strategy like that he'd used before. So he was thinking, well, I've done that before, it didn't quite work out. I don't want to do it again because they might expect something like that to happen. Let me try to do something that's unexpected. He has also come out and said that a general attack might have been good for the morale of the soldiers. He often complained, especially about the slow-moving nature of trench warfare, and he said about the Army of the Cumberland, which was the one that was involved mainly down in the fighting at Pigeon Hill, that it seemed like every time they found a freshly furrowed field, they'd stop and want to build an earthwork because they thought it was a Confederate trench. All right, so this, again, slow-moving, and he's on a time crunch. And he really thinks this is going to work out. It's also very important to realize that when it comes to the planning for the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, Sherman gave the orders, but he's got 3 Army generals that he gives the orders to. And those orders aren't, hey, General McPherson with the Army of the Tennessee, I want you to attack here at Pigeon Hill. And George Thomas, I want you to attack at Cheatham Hill. It was, my Army commanders will find a point that they think is a good point to attack and send their troops forward. Right. So ultimately, he does order the assault, but it's up to the Army generals and then those other commanding officers below them to choose how this operation ends up developing. So where we're at right now is near where there was a Confederate picket line, and I kind of touched on that before. The picket line is a series of rifle pits that were set ahead of the main line. The idea being that these guys were essentially skirmishers or sharpshooters. They would sit in those rifle pits, pot shots back and forth, obviously. But if there was a general attack that would occur, their job was to make a lot of noise, maybe fire a volley or 2, and then rush back to the main line. And that was the way for the main line to realize that they were being attacked, so they don't get snuck up on in the dark. And so what ends up happening, though, is on the day of the battle, on June 27, 1864, the picket line here at this portion of Pigeon Hill is manned by the 63rd Georgia. Now, it's also important to note that there weren't many units from Georgia that were fighting in Georgia during the Atlanta campaign. Most of them were attached to the Army of Northern Virginia, and they were fighting with Lee up in Virginia. It kind of seems backwards, but these guys actually were pretty green. They had seen very little combat. They had been brought up from guarding railroad stations near Savannah, Georgia, as this Atlanta campaign began to mature and the Confederates needed extra forces to bolster their numbers. And so they're sitting here in their little picket line, and wouldn't you know it, there's an entire brigade of Union soldiers that have swung around and are pressing against them. And when we talk about numbers, we have a regiment which at its fullest strength would be about 1,000 men or so, give or take. By this point in the war, with disease and everything else that's happened, that number is decreased significantly. When we talk about a brigade, there is 6 of these regiments against them. So they're outnumbered 6-1, and they're green. They have no combat experience. All of these Union soldiers that went out on this Atlanta campaign have been fighting these same, mostly Confederate soldiers for the last 3 years. So they are battle hardened. They've been through it already. This is just another day at the office for a lot of them, right? And so also when we talk about the terrain that's involved, there is a subdivision over there. It wasn't there at the time. Most of this would have been, as it was described on the day of the battle, kind of like a gnarled, swampy kind of area, right? And so what ends up happening is the Union forces that swing south of the road under Light Branch Brigade, and they press up against the Confederates manning these fortifications. The Confederates have a hard time actually seeing them come at them until they're basically, I see the whites of your eyes, right? And they wait until they are super close to get that first shot off, and by that time they are just absolutely steamrolled. And the fighting breaks down to hand-to-hand combat, and which is something that you hardly ever see during the Civil War. Usually these armies don't get that close, but here they are. And we have a really awesome description from a soldier with the 63rd Georgia that was involved in that day's fighting. And by the end of the day, the 63rd Georgia would suffer more casualties than any unit involved during the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. This will give you an idea of how bad this ends up for them. But he says, in Walker's front, which is near back left of you guys, their approach was hidden from view by a dense forest growth, except on the extreme right adjoining French, who was up on Little Kennesaw. So he's describing who is in command of these earthworks behind, where the pits running across the open field were held by Company C of our regiment. The company retired with French's pickets, leaving a vacancy in the line. So as the Union Army approaches, they fire off their volley. They begin to press back across this big open field towards the wood line where the main line is at. But they leave the vacancy in the line, right? The Oglethorpes were in reserve, and Major Allen, misled by Captain Buckner as to the situation and ignorant of the fact that the attacking column had already reached our skirmish line, ordered the company in to fill the gap. So now, because of a problem with information from leadership, the commanding officers have ordered, instead of just keeping those guys, letting them return to the main line, and then continuing to fight, he's ordered those men in the main line forward to try and bolster the strength of the skirmishers, which doesn't make much sense. As you can imagine, what do you think that ends up with? You've got people going back, you've got people going forward, it becomes a confused mess. And right behind them, hot on their heels, are 6 regiments of Union soldiers. Gallantly led by Lieutenant Blanchard and McLaughlin, they advance at a double quick step, so they're sprinting across this open field. And on reaching the open field, were met by a murderous fire both from the front and flank. The French's deserted pits were already occupied by the enemy. So a lot of the Union soldiers have captured these fighting positions, and they're basically firing back across this open field, using them as cover. The woods to the left and front were swarming with bluecoats. He's talking about this area back through here and along our front. On a portion of the line held by Company K, they had reached the pits, and a hand-to-hand conflict ensued. Men fought with club muskets. So the idea of a bayonet charge, although that was a thing, it did happen over at Pigeon Hill, the bayonet was very rarely used when it comes to hand-to-hand combat. Most of these soldiers realized that it was just kind of an awkward thing to try and use. It made it kind of harder to fire the weapon because it was a muzzle loader. And so, keep it simple. They would just use the guns as clubs when it came to that. A short-legged Irishman of that company, with the unusual name of John Smith, had his gun seized by a stalwart Yankee, and there was a struggle for its possession. The little son of Aaron was game, but was overmatched in strength, and shoving his opponent backward as the gun was wrenched from his hands, he said, "To hell with you and the gun too." Lieutenant George A. Bailey of Company B had his ear grazed by a meaning a bullet, and his antagonist 20 feet away, that's how close these guys are, reloaded to fire again. Having no weapon but his sword, Lieutenant B decided to emulate David in his contest with Goliath, and picking up a stone, he threw it, striking his foe squarely between the eyes and placing him hors de combat for a time at least. So imagine the frenzied nature of that hand-to-hand engagement where they're lobbing stones at each other, clubbing each other with bayonets, or with rifles. Further up the line and near the vacant pits, another member of the regiment, whose name is not recalled, stood loading and firing as rapidly as his teeth could tear the cartridges and his hands could ram them home. His face was cold and pallid and bloodless, but not from fear. Blackened with powder stain through which the perspiration trickled in streams, his eyes flashed defiance with every flash from his gun. While disdaining the protection of the pits, he stood there a perfect demon of war with no thought save to kill. They had picked up something too hot to hold, however. Attacked both in front and flank by largely superior numbers, they, meaning the Confederates, were in a veritable hornet's nest. They fought bravely to hold their position, but the odds were too great, and George McLaughlin, seeing that it was wholesale death or capture, sang out, "Save yourselves, boys." That's not something you want to hear from your commanding officer, right? The place was too hot to hold and almost to let go. So they were even having trouble fleeing from the field of battle. For 200 or 300 yards to the rear was an open field sloping upwards, talking about this one right behind us. To retire through this, bullet swept as it was at a short range, was simply to court death. Obliquely to the rear was a piece of woodland from which some protection could be gained. Most of the men made a break for this. Some of them ran squarely into the arms of the enemy who had possession of the woods and were captured. Some failed to leave the pits in time and were taken prisoners there. Some ran the gauntlet safely, while others brought to the rear in frame or limp a perpetual souvenir of that warm day. Now, what was it like for the generals? What were they seeing? Well, talk about Samuel French again. If you've ever hiked around Kennesaw Mountain, you might notice a rock up near the summit of Little Kennesaw that we call French's Rock. And there's not much more information about what that might be. But that's where we believe Samuel French, Confederate general, was kind of peeking behind this big rock and looking out over the field of battle. And he said, there appeared great activity among the Federal officers and generals all along my front and up and down the lines. Artillery firing was common at all times on the line, but now, just before 8 a.m., it swelled in volume and extended down to the extreme left, where Pigeon Hill is at, his left. And it was so loud, that initial bombardment, that you could hear it from Atlanta, 20 miles away. It sounded like a thunderstorm in the hills. Then from 50 guns burst out simultaneously in my front, while battery after battery following on the right disclosed a general attack on our entire line. Presently, as if by magic, there sprang from the earth a host of men, and in one waving line of blue the infantry advanced. And what's interesting is he goes on to describe it as almost in a very poetic way of watching 100,000 men arrayed in the strife of battle. And you can see the dichotomy there between what he was experiencing up safe in his perch, more or less, and the struggle of the men actually on the field of battle. Lieutenant Colonel Robert A. Fulton of the 53rd Ohio, so one of the Union officers that was here, he notes about the fighting in this field. He says, the rebels fought with a desperation worthy of a better cause. His own men never showed more gallantry, mounting the works, shooting the enemy, and beating them over the heads with the butts of their guns. So, what happened? That seems like it should end well for the Union forces, right? Well, if you go back towards the main line in that wood line, one thing that we recently discovered was that the Confederates had a 3-inch ordnance rifle, so a rifled artillery piece, and there was batteries all along that portion of the line, aimed squarely down this open stretch of field. And so, if you are fighting an artillery piece, the last place you want to be is in an open area. So they begin to be rocked with shells from that 3-inch ordnance rifle, as well as some of the cannons that are perched up on Middle Kennesaw and over on Pigeon Hill, and some of the other cannons that are just to my right back here obliquely. And the field is just not a good place to be. So they're unable to make it to the main Confederate line to actually engage with those soldiers. A lot of the fighting just happens in this big open field, and before you know it, they're basically shelled to the point to where they have to go back to their own main line, and the fighting breaks down here. When we talk about the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, it lasted about 2 hours, but in many of the places where the fighting was most contested, like even at Cheatham Hill, the fighting would have taken less time than this program has already taken. Right? It was that quick. So does anybody have any questions or anything before we actually go across the road and then up the hill?
Is this Pigeon Hill right here?
Yep, that's the hill.
And where is Little Kennesaw from there?
So Little Kennesaw is just beyond it. Pigeon Hill is actually a spur off of that second peak, Little Kennesaw.
And then Big Kennesaw is even
Just
further.
beyond that. Yep. It basically runs in a kind of a imperfect north-south line between those peaks.
Thank you.
So the Union came in this way and they also flanked from that way?
Yeah, so they basically pushed on through here, and they were able to capture portions of the wood line back there. And that's, that led to some cover and concealment, but
And this is where the picket line was facing this way or all around?
close. So it was probably further into where these houses were, but again, we tried to save what we could.
So did the retreating pickets get caught by friendly fire?
It probably would have happened that way, and I say probably because I don't have any information specifically about this point, but I know over at Cheatham Hill, one of the things that Sam Watkins himself even mentions is that it seemed like the brave men who actually tried to storm the works were caught between two fires, and it did seem to be that way. That, and he even says it seems that just as many Yankees were killed. He says, yeah, this is a direct quote. Were killed by their own men as by us, because again, it was just caught in between this firestorm of bullets going around, especially when you get to those close distances like that. But
And the 3-inch barrel gun was out.
yeah, it was back there. So interesting story. We had to reroute the New Salem Church Trail because of how dangerous the original crossing was. It was basically around a blind curve. And so when our superintendent came in, our new superintendent, Patrick Gammon, one of the first things that he did was he worked to get that crosswalk moved further south so it wasn't so dangerous. And so that was a whole big trail reroute, and part of that was an archaeological survey that had to be done. And in the middle of all of that, they found an unexploded Hotchkiss shell, basically an unexploded cannonball that was still live. We turned it over to the bomb squad, and it did go boom. So yeah, and we were like, well, that is kind of odd. And the way that it was turned, where they found it, it was like that's a Confederate shell. But you get into these kind of myths that the Confederacy never has anything good. They've always got all the kind of outdated weaponry. And we go back to the archives, and we were looking up, what batteries were owning what pieces. And it just so happened that there was a 3-inch ordnance over in that section of the battlefield firing down this open area. And for one reason or another, it was a dud, right, at that point. So, kind of interesting. Yeah, we still find stuff all the time. Excellent. Now imagine doing that in the middle of June, 110 degrees in the shade, with the worst kind of Frankenstein shoes that you've ever worn.
And what kind of pack?
It just depends. Usually they would strip a lot of that down when they were going on the assault. So bare minimum, they would probably have their water kit along with their cartridge belt and their rifle, which would have been about 7 pounds or so. So it wasn't like a lot of the soldiers in the Somme or D-Day where they were just strapped to the hilt. Most of that stuff you would leave back in the camps. But all right, so how many rounds did a soldier were they able to fire before having to be reloaded, and how long did it take? So for the average infantryman, if you were really pushing it and you were really well drilled, you could do the 9 steps of loading, and then it's actually 12 if you count ready, aim, fire. For loading and firing your weapon system, in about 20 seconds. So it involved quite a few steps. I wish I had one on me, but basically you'd have to withdraw the cartridge, bring it up to your teeth, rip it. The cartridge itself contains the bullet, which is a 58 caliber round, so slow moving, hard hitting, big bullet, along with about 60 grains of black powder. And you would dump the contents down the muzzle of your weapon. Then you would take your ramrod out and ram it home, pack it down neat. And then you have your bullet, you have your black powder. What's missing?
The charge?
Yeah, spark, basically. So separately, in another little pouch, they would carry what was essentially a primer in their cap box, percussion cap. And inside of the cap, there was a chemical called fulminate of mercury, which acted kind of like a match head today. And so you would put that on what they call the nipple of the gun behind the hammer, and when that hammer slammed down, that friction would cause a spark, and that spark would be shot down to where black powder was, and it would fire the bullet out. Now, there have been instances where they find guns with 6, 7 bullets rammed down them, and a lot of people attribute that to maybe just fear, missing a step. One thing that I like to put forward is maybe it's less about that, and you have to think about how chaotic and loud the battle actually is around you. And these weapons were notorious for gunking up and fouling up after a few shots. And I'm with the infantry. I do a lot of the infantry demonstrations here where we dress up and we go out in the field and shoot. And I'll tell you, just even shooting 2 or 3 charges, right? Every once in a while you get a misfire, and if you're in a line with several hundred or 1,000 people, it's hard to really tell, besides just the kick of your weapon, if it's gone off or not, right? And so maybe a lot of that has to do with that. And once it gets gunked up, you have to go in and in many cases you have to take the cone off sometimes and really get into that where the friction primer sits, the cap, and really try to finagle and clear away. If a spark can't get into the black powder, it's not going to go off, right? So,
Plus it was raining.
yeah. Well, if it was raining, or any of these other conditions, you just have to imagine it being fouled up.
Will wet powder fire?
No, nope. And in fact, not to go too far off into a tangent, but often cases when you find these mini balls, you'll find a lot of them that have not been fired. They're in like almost pristine condition, and a lot of that was just because the powder would get wet or would get fouled up, and they would just dump them on the ground. And so we find a lot of those. By the end of the 4 months of the Atlanta campaign, the Union Army had gone through over 2 million rounds of ammunition, one way or the other. Just to give you an idea of how much firing was going on. Now, where we're standing at right now, right behind me, is the trench. This is the main trench line for our Confederates. After 160 years of kind of nature beginning to take it over and erosion being setting in, you have to imagine, though, that at the time of the battle, this would have looked a lot more like a World War I style trench. It would have been built up and fortified with lumber. You would have had a headlog, and I'll pass this around. This is a picture of what some of these trenches look like outside of Atlanta, just to give you an idea. So a headlog that you would fire underneath to keep you from getting hit. You can see the skid poles running kind of back and forth at an angle. That's so that if that headlog takes a direct hit, especially from artillery, instead of it falling over and crushing you, it's going to roll down the skid poles. And it adds further structure to the trench itself. You would have had barricades out in front of it. Many times they would chop down saplings, and then they would tie the branches together, or they would take these sharpened pikes, basically these sticks, and then almost like a hay rack, they would kind of have several of these at eye level right in front of the trench line. They didn't have barbed wire back then, so they did what they could. Then you would have a firing step in many cases, so you would hop up onto the firing step to shoot. Now, going back to firing in an actual combat scenario, what we have found for a lot of these battles here is that you would usually have one person that was shooting, you would have the shooter, and then you'd have 2 or 3 other people behind him that were reloading. And so there was, instead of firing and then having to stop and everybody's doing that, you'd have one guy that would fire, he'd send his rifle back, he'd have a fresh rifle put forward, fire, and it'd just be this constant rotation around. So they were able to lay down a pretty impressive amount of fire, and that basically comes from just experience, right? What works and what doesn't when you actually get out onto the battlefield. Lots of really cool stuff happening right here. I'd like to first talk about this wayside sign because it has a photograph. This was taken by George Barnard after the armies have moved through this area, and it's taken at this exact spot. And you can tell because the rock in the foreground of the picture is the rock that's right behind us here. So you can see bits of the Confederate line. You can see what it would have looked like back then. Just some tree coverage, the road beyond, but mostly clear for the most part.
That's the rock on the bottom.
Just this one right here. Yeah, let me get out of the way. And we are pretty much looking out towards the west. So right in front of me, I can see the roof of what I like to call Old McDonald's farm. The guy that has all the llamas and the, Wilburs over there and everything. So we are looking straight down the western side of the slope, across Old Mountain Road. The intersection would be to our left. And this was an avenue of approach for that middle brigade coming up, which was Smith's brigade, coming up the western slope with the idea of basically capturing these works. And this section of works, they were manned by Cockrell's brigade, so namely troops from Missouri. Now, another little interesting fact about the battle that happens here at this spot is you have the 6th Missouri fighting against the 6th Missouri Union forces, right? Statesmen fighting against each other. And I've heard accounts that, we just didn't fire as much because we knew we were firing on our own men. The Confederates did not hold to that principle, apparently, because very quickly they ran out of ammunition. And they began to roll boulders down against the Federals as they're coming up. And they get close. They get within a stone's throw of the Confederate line. Now, we have another little anecdote about the Missouri troops, namely 2 brothers who were tasked with having to go back beyond the slope to this little kind of pocket of dead space where there was an ordnance train to try and get some more ammunition for the fight. And it's just one of those odd things that you hear about in war that's just, it doesn't quite make sense, but it's almost funny after the fact, right? But let's see here. There we go. Yes. So I have them color coded: blue for Union, gray for Confederate. Isn't that smart? William Irvin with the 3rd, 5th Consolidated Missouri. What that means is through the course of the war, these 2 units have acquired so many casualties that they now have to be consolidated into a singular unit to have some kind of combat strength, right? So him and his brother, side by side, we climbed the rugged heights, crossed over the summit, and reached the safety of the ordnance train, asking for 3,000 rounds of Enfield ammunition. And Enfield is a British-made rifle, which is kind of, I'm going to say it, but kind of a copy of the American-made Springfield, which is mostly what the Union Army has available. We found red tape there. What do you guess it? The officer wanted a requisition. He says, "Where's your paperwork, son? Has it been signed 3 times?" We had no time to comply, obviously. An old musket stood nearby. I picked up the old and familiar gun, which was loaded and capped, and said, "Here's my requisition. Give us 3,000 rounds now and do it quickly." It was done. We took 1 box each on our shoulders and 1 between us. We climbed the rugged heights from east and began the descent to the west. 200 or 300 feet from the summit, a shell coming from the front burst between us, front or rear, I know not which, and scattered us 30 or 40 feet apart, the box between causing a lively miniature battle. It all exploded as so many firecrackers in a barrel, but more terrific. When the shock was over, I asked John, his brother, if he were hurt, and he answered that he was not. So in the midst of the bursting shell, we gathered each 1,000 rounds. I guess they stopped to count. Once in line, the ammunition was distributed. So, again, just that kind of like, yeah, can you imagine that? I wonder if they got in trouble for that after the fact. But Major Thomas T. Taylor with the 47th Ohio Union Army said the regiment at Pigeon Hill faced the sheeted flame filled with missiles, giving forth 10,000 shrieks and tones, intensified by the cries of agony and the torture of the wounded. And he's basically crawling on his belly up the slope, and he's looking for cover. He says, when I got up with the line, I laid down behind a small rock from which I could see the greater portion of the material part of the line. The Rebs soon got the range of the rock, and every time I opened my mouth or gave an order, zip, came a bullet against the stone. At various points, I sheltered myself behind trees and had the infinite time and again of hearing balls intended expressly for my body strike the tree behind which I stood or sat, and more than once the dirt and bark was knocked in my face. And Private Joseph Gresham of the 83rd Indiana says, the scene of this day's fight beggars all description. The ground all around the mountain is exceedingly rough. Deep ravines, steep hills, sloughs, open fields, and thickets are intermingled together in indescribable confusion. Over such and all of these we had to charge, so that it was difficult to tell our position or see from what quarter danger threatened us most. So in the midst of all of this confusion, they even have trouble trying to figure out where the main Confederate line is. And they're just getting fire from basically a bunch of different sides, cannon fire, musketry fire, and they're just struggling to get up the hill. Sometimes the missiles of death were showered upon us and seemed to come down from over our heads, and shells would strike and plow up the ground, covering us in dirt and bursting in the earth, would kill or wound some and hoist others from a chosen position. These things, mingled with the cries of the wounded and dying of both armies, made the scene terrible. So the order to fall back was given at that point. They were unable to gain the slope of the hill. Where we crossed over right here, this trail initially was put in by the CCC camp, and it runs right through the main trench line. You know, we don't do that kind of thing anymore, but back then they did care about preserving the place, obviously, but they were also thinking, well, it would be great to be able to stand where they stood. And so over here towards the left, and we'll see the sign here in a minute, is a battery position for Lumsden's Alabama Battery. It's a 4-gun cannon position. And have you guys hiked to the top of Big Kennesaw Mountain before, or been up there before? Those cannons that we have on top, that is where Lumsden began. So they dragged those cannons up on top of the mountain, 100 men per cannon, to get some of these cannons up there. And they're looking out, and they're trying to find things within range to fire at against the Union forces. They really can't see anything. And so what they do find is an old water tower that is supplying a Union train for its water. And they say, we put a couple shots through that. They said, we scattered water and Yankees everywhere. And they just, I guess, gave each other high fives and stuff. What they didn't realize is that there was a Union artillery position that was already beaded on the mountain, and they were just waiting for an opportunity to strike. And so as soon as they saw the puffs of white smoke on top of the mountain, Lumsden's men actually, they said they went to work on us scientifically, is how he describes it. The first round burst 5 feet over the earthworks, and it didn't stop for the better part of 2 days. So they were in a world of hurt. And so basically that position was more or less untenable for the guns that they had, so they were swapped out with another position, and they were sent down here. So this is where Lumsden's battery is on the day of the battle, and they're supplying defense for these Union earthworks.
They brought the cannons all the way back down here.
Yep.
Wow.
It just didn't work out up there, I guess.
Oh. So the ones that are up there now, replicas?
Yeah, well, so not typically. So as you go throughout the park, you're going to find a bunch of cannons. Most of them are from the Civil War. It's really hard to figure out what kind of units they were attached to or what battles they'd seen unless you get lucky. A lot of those records have been destroyed. We do have a couple of reproductions in the park. I think maybe 3 or 4, but the rest of them are actually from the Civil War. Sometimes we get lucky, as in the case of the one that's in our museum. We found a photograph where the photographer, the same guy that took this picture actually, in Atlanta, was looking down the barrel or the bore of the weapon, and that's where the serial number was at. So we were able to trace that back through the database to a gun that was here, and it took a lot. I mean, that makes it sound easy, right? But to be able to figure out what unit that was attached to, our historians, many of them volunteers who had been serving with the park for the better part of 50 years. Some of these guys on the cannon crew that have been here since the 1970s, they looked at that photograph and they had to basically triangulate in a weird way the different things in the background that they could see, the buildings, anything that could be used as a clue, and they were able to position it at a battery position in one of the little angles there near the city of Atlanta, near where the Fox Theater is today. And so
Oh, wow.
it took a lot of homework, but they were able to finally figure out that this was the gun. It belonged to this unit. That unit was a New York unit that had been over near Kolb's Farm, Battery M of the 1st New York Light Artillery, and then moved kind of closer to Cheatham Hill and was part of the batteries firing against that position during the day of the battle. So, yeah, those ones on top of the mountain itself, that was not there, since the battle, obviously. We put those there in the 1960s. We had a gracious Vietnam veteran helicopter pilot by the name, can't make this up, Colonel Sanders, who brought them in piece by piece up to the top of the mountain. Yeah. So, you guys ready to go up and finish this thing off? Back in that little corner is where Dallas was. So they moved from that area over to this area in a little under 3 weeks. You guys good?
So that's Lost Mountain? So
Yep.
There's really a mountain. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we call it mountains. This Big Kennesaw is only 700 feet tall, so really it's just kind of a big hill,
Big
but
hill, yes.
it's a mountain to us, right?
Seems like more than 700 when you climb.
So can you see that? So we, standing on top of Stone Mountain, we see Kennesaw because
Yep.
it's, the little dip between the two. I
Like a
wonder
camel.
if that's something we see from Stone Mountain. It's Lost Mountain.
I don't know, because Stone Mountain is kind of towards the east. I wonder if it would be, I think it would be too far beyond. Maybe it would be blocking it actually, because this is almost towards the west. So kind of behind Kennesaw.
Point to Atlanta.
Atlanta would be back, let's see, there's Marietta, so Atlanta would be just beyond that area.
Okay.
Kind of to the southeast of us. Like your shirt, man, Power Rangers. That's cool. I was watching Power Rangers when I was that age too.
We heard a story that maybe you could reflect on this. There was no real major battle at Stone Mountain itself. There was no significant stronghold there.
So Stone Mountain, as the war was raging through North Georgia, it actually became a spot for refugees to camp. So it was there for the longest time, up until basically the Union Army started operating around that area. But there's no real battle on Stone Mountain itself. It became more of a symbolic thing. And then the fighting was more concentrated around the railroad lines in and out of the city of Atlanta. And there were several battles around the city of Atlanta, culminating with the Battle of Jonesboro, which really was the last big one. But there was no fighting on top of what would become Lee's Head or anything like that. Yeah. All right, we're gonna go a little bit further. I love taking people out here when it's so crazy. Whenever you hike around this area, each season is almost like a totally different park, right? And it's really nice being out here in the winter because you can see the excuse that we have for winter, right? Because you can basically see through all these trees and you get a nice view of most things.
Mm-hmm.
What we're looking down into now is a gorge, a section of area in between the spur at Pigeon Hill and Little Kennesaw. And there wasn't much reconnaissance that was really worth anything done on the Union forces before they pressed men into this area. The idea was to try and find a way through between these two peaks, and then as part of that major capture of that roadway going into Marietta. And I don't know, are you guys familiar with the Battle of Pickett's Mill at all? So in Dallas, this has all happened before, there was a section of battlefield along that line where Union forces were funneled into a deep gorge, and it became a turkey shoot. And this is basically the exact same thing that happens here. So when the 4 regiments that are let loose here towards the north under Walcott, I always remember that name because he's cutting through the wall here at Little Kennesaw, they press forward with the attempt to get in between these peaks and come around on the opposite side. This is what it looked like. There was a lot of dead timber around. Initially, those Union soldiers were able to break through that picket line like they did down in the open field, but they were thinking at that time that that was the main line. They thought that that was a job well done, right? And they continued forward only to find that they're at the very tips of the points of the weapons of the actual Confederate main line, which stretches again over the peak, down below, and then up Little Kennesaw. So as you can imagine, there's firing going on from artillery and from the infantry into this gorge. And again, it becomes a turkey shoot from all angles, and confusion erupts, right? There's even a section of men that tried to scale the side of Little Kennesaw, just anything to try and find a way out of this death trap that's become the gorge down below.
No? Yes? Yeah, maybe. Maybe.
It's always awkward saying things like that. You know, when a happy family is moving here.
Sorry, excuse that.
Oh, you guys are fine. Whenever I have some of these tours out and I'm doing the whole big thing in the open field and there's like a family having a picnic right next to it, it's like, beautiful day, isn't it?
Don't mind the carnage.
Tell us again the total casualties on both sides here.
Yeah, so for the Union forces, it was about 550. So
50?
give or take, yep. And for the Confederates, it was around 150 or so. So, 1 out of 10 or so Union soldiers that stepped out didn't make it back.
Morning.
Good morning. And this was probably the worst place to be. There really wasn't much in the way of cover or concealment besides all of this fallen, these boulders and the fallen logs and things. And so what ended up happening is, after it became apparent that the Union forces would not break through the main line, in many cases they had to wait for dark to be able to get back to their own main line, and they had to kind of like crawl and sneak their way back. So Corporal George S. Richardson, an NCO from the 6th Iowa, who was in the gorge, and he had seen combat as far back as Shiloh. So this guy is not green, and he'd seen some of the, what we would consider some of the heaviest combat in the Western Theater of Operations during the Civil War. He goes on to describe the fighting here in the gorge. He says, our loss in killed and wounded was heavy. I was not hurt, though a ball came near enough to cut off my canteen and then put three holes in another man's coat, but without any other injury. The assault was an awful battle. I was thankful to get out so easy, for it looked like almost certain death to charge where we did over the piles of fallen timber up a mountainside and right onto the very points of their bayonets. I have thought I'd seen men look fiendish, but I never did before. They stood by their works until we rushed within 50 yards of them. Then they poured death and destruction among us, but we did not stop for that, but crouching as low as possible when we went up, they saw that we had come for everything that they had. So, I mean, I guess he's kind of like a silver lining kind of guy after the fact, isn't he? But ultimately, in this section of the battle, as I mentioned before, several hundred casualties, obviously more so with the attackers than the defenders. The Confederates were successful in being able to defend this portion of the line, as they were in basically every portion of the line, as far as I could see with the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. This frustrated Sherman to no end. He kept asking George H. Thomas down where he was at. He was actually up in a platform near where the traffic circle is as you're breaking off towards Cheatham Hill Road, if you're familiar with this area, called Signal Hill. And he kept asking Thomas, can we send in more men against the area at Cheatham Hill? And he asked him a few different times through telegraph, and eventually Thomas had to say, if we keep sending men forward, you're going to chew up this army, right? So the defenses were just too strong. And Sherman would learn his lesson. He would know he would never again make the mistake of attacking in this fashion a very well-defended line. And, he kind of has to go back to the drawing board. It's not easy for him. And obviously the Confederates are just overjoyed with their victory against him at this point. That's going to come into play in a minute. But Sherman basically says, well, I didn't want to do this, but it looks like I have no other choice. I'm going to give my men 10 days worth of rations, and I'm going to move around them. The reason why he's able to come to this conclusion is because there is a bit of good news that comes out of the battle here. Even though it is pretty much substantially a Confederate victory. There's 3,000 Union soldiers lost against 1,000 Confederates during the entirety of the battle. That equates to about 1 out of 5 Union soldiers, with half of the casualties being just at Cheatham Hill alone, 1,600, you can imagine. So on the day of the battle, if you guys remember when I was first talking, I mentioned that reconnaissance by force that was happening far to the south of the line. It was meant to be a diversionary attack during the original orders when they were put out, but the day after, the orders for that portion of the line were rescinded. You guys doing okay?
Yeah.
And then it became a reconnaissance by force. And the idea was that they needed to find a way across a swollen creek down there called Ollie's Creek, which is past where the park boundary is today. And the Union soldiers down there were fighting in what would be described by them as Indian style, so skirmishers that were darting in between the trees. They met up with some resistance from Confederate cavalry under a Confederate officer by the name of Jackson, but they were pretty easy to be able to get them spooked off, essentially. And much to their surprise, they found that they were behind the Confederate line. They were closer to Atlanta than the Confederates were. So it opened up this kind of back door behind the Confederates. And Sherman, again, although he probably didn't want to do that because he had done that in Dallas to pretty devastating results for the most part, he decided that that's the best next course of action. Give his men 10 days worth of rations, start moving them far off of the railroad line, around through that back door. And what that left with Johnston, the Confederate commander of the Army of Tennessee, is he saw that movement kind of happening, and he heard rumblings of this door that had been opened behind his line. And the Confederate government is pounding on him, saying, why don't you take the initiative? You've won a great victory against Sherman. Use it. Defeat him. Launch an attack. Drive him out of Georgia, out of Tennessee. Johnston, on the other hand, says, well, if he tries to swing around me, it's all just kind of chess work, right? They actually call it, the fighting here in Georgia, the red clay minuet, because it seems like back and forth. Johnston, on the other hand, thinks, well, if I allow him to get behind me with enough people, that gives him the advantage, and I have to be reacting to whatever Sherman is doing, which is not something that he really wants to do. So he goes back to his tried and true method of just falling back. So in the middle of the night, on July 2nd, 1864, the Confederates abandoned the Kennesaw line, and they moved back closer to the Chattahoochee River. Now, this obviously is not going to bode well for Johnston, and there's an investigation that's launched. Just to give you an idea of the lack of communication that's going on between him and Jefferson Davis, who was the Confederate president, supposedly Davis didn't even find out that the Confederates had gone into Atlanta from Johnston, but from a newspaper article. So, right? And so there's an investigation that's launched. Braxton Bragg, who was the former commander of this Confederate army and is now Davis's right-hand man, military advisor essentially, is brought to Atlanta to question Johnston on his plan for Atlanta, and I guess the answers just weren't up to snuff. And so in the middle of that important time in that campaign, when the real siege of Atlanta is going to begin, they switch army commanders for the Confederate Army. And Johnston is removed from command July 17th, 1864, and that more aggressive Confederate commander, John Bell Hood, is put in place. And Hood is, personally, just personal feelings, I feel like he is in many ways blamed for a lot of the things that happened with the ending of the war and the taking of Atlanta. He made some really bad decisions, I'll be honest, but those were decisions that the government were pressuring him to make. And he was young, he was very enthusiastic, and he really wanted to make a name for himself at this point. He was aggressive. He had fought under Lee at Gettysburg, where he was wounded. He fought at Chickamauga, where he was heavily wounded. And so he wanted to do something that like Lee would do, right? What would Lee do? Well, he wanted to be aggressive like that. And he wanted to do almost like what Lee had done in the Battle of Seven Pines and the 7 Days battles outside of Richmond, Virginia in 1862, where the Union Army was right at the doorstep of Richmond, and they could hear the church bells in the city. And Johnston lost command, and Lee stepped forward to take command of that army. And Lee drove McClellan and the Union forces away from Richmond, and that became his army. And so maybe there was some inkling of that this is his moment now. But in reality, it was just probably the wrong time, the wrong place, the wrong time. They weren't in 1862 anymore, and he was not Robert E. Lee, right? He tried to fight Sherman on his own ground, not defensively, but offensively, as Sherman is operating around the city, as the city is being shelled. And what he really does is he chews up the army. There's more casualties sustained in the fighting around Atlanta than during the rest of the Atlantic campaign combined. And eventually Sherman is able to just swing around the city, cut the supply line at Jonesboro. I make it sound simple. It really wasn't that simple. But and eventually the city does fall September 2nd, 1864. So word goes back to Washington. Atlanta is ours and fairly won, just in time for
Your
Election.
when you know it. Yep. So the point that I like to make there is it's really odd because you had this Confederate victory here that ultimately spelled more or less defeat in the long run for the campaign, right? Because if it hadn't been for those expectations from the government on Johnson's shoulders, if he hadn't been switched out of command after this, who knows what would have happened. Maybe, I mean, he was talking about using the militia to kind of hold the city. There's even letters from Confederate soldiers to their loved ones. It's kind of funny, talking about how much ground they're losing in the campaign. And they said, well, if we keep doing what we're doing, then the pivotal battle for Atlanta will be fought in Florida, I think is what he said. So it was kind of a running joke. Now, ultimately, Lincoln would be reelected. Now, what does that have to do with us? This is a national park site. So national parks typically are there to protect and preserve areas that should have been deemed should be untrammeled, so untouched by the hands of man, more or less, and also to protect and preserve sites that are historically significant to our story as Americans. If you had a Martian that came to Earth and you said, I've heard a lot about these American people, can you tell me more about them? And you made a circuit and you just drove around all the national parks in the country, they would have a really good idea from start to finish of who we are as a people, the good, the bad, the in-between, right? And this is part of that. You can imagine, and it throws it into what if land. What if Sherman had not captured Atlanta? What if Lincoln had not been reelected, right? What would our world look like? It's also important to note as well, the Civil War was incredibly traumatic for us as a nation. By the end of the 4 months of fighting for the Atlantic campaign, there'd be 75,000 casualties on either side. For the entirety of the Civil War, we're looking at around 700,000 casualties. By today's number, inflated by the population that we have today, that'd be around 6 million people, which is Metro Atlanta, the area of Metro Atlanta, gone, right, in 4 years, mainly by disease. And so it says a lot about us as Americans in our tenacity that even through all of that, we ripped each other apart, duct taped each other back together with some of the weakest duct tape we can find with Reconstruction, right? And even through all of that, we were able to press forward, become a singular country, United States of America. We have opinions on either side, especially regarding this war, which are still raging even to this day. But ultimately, we were able to come out on top. Just 50 years after this battle is the outbreak of World War I. A week before the outbreak of World War I, we have Union veterans that have gone down to Cheatham Hill, and they have purchased 60 acres of land, which would be the seed that this park sprouts from and grows to now the 3,000 acres that we're able to protect and preserve today. And they are having a memorial service for the fallen, that as they experience it here at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, they erect the Illinois Monument, right? This great moment of almost like a reconciliation. But just 50 years after we were a divided nation, outbreak of World War I, a couple years after that, we get involved in that. What would the world have looked like if there had been two Americas here, right? How would that have looked like in the turn of the 20th century as we had all of these massive global conflicts that began to break out? And again, I think that speaks a lot to us as a people, not just for this park, but for every national park that you visit that has anything to do with the Civil War. It's really cool that you can walk the ground and you can see what happened here when we as a people stopped talking about things and we decided to take up arms against each other. But does anybody have any questions or anything at that point?
So ultimately, all the Confederate soldiers here, they fell back. Did they go to Atlanta to try to defend it?
So ultimately, they ended up closer to Smyrna, and then there was a couple of different lines. One of the more famous, I would say, are the line of defenses along the Chattahoochee River, which for the most part weren't really utilized all that well, but they're really cool defenses. And then they ended up in the city of Atlanta. So, and then they pull out of the city. Sherman occupies the city until November 15th. And during that time, he's trying to figure out what else he's going to do. The Confederates move back up to the north, so back this way, and they start trying to strike at his supply lines over near the Allatoona mountain chain, towards the kind of the middle of really the kind of the end of October there. And he dedicates most of his army, half of his army, with the Army of the Cumberland up to dealing with them, and that leaves most of Georgia just kind of open. And so at the time, Grant there's a lot of ideas that are kind of floating back and forth. Maybe Grant needs some help with Lee, and maybe Sherman could go up and kind of help him out, take some of his forces and do that. But Sherman has the idea of cutting his own supply line, disappearing into the wilderness. It's harvest time, so he can live off the land, people's crops, basically, and just popping up in Savannah. And again, that kind of wrecking and extinguishing the fire in the belly of the Confederates. And that becomes Sherman's famous March to the Sea. So on November 15th is when he launches that. By the end of the fighting around Atlanta, so by the end of November, when everything is kind of said and done, about 40% of the city would be destroyed. And they'd have to rebuild.
When was the surrender signed?
So it just depends on which surrender you're talking about, because we have the surrender that happens with Lee, then we have the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and then these armies are still fighting each other. Sherman's gone up, captured Savannah, gone up through the Carolinas. There's fighting in North Carolina. Johnston has come back into command of this army after this army was defeated at the Battle of Franklin in Tennessee. In a single day's battle, there were 6 Confederate generals that were killed here in Franklin. And so Hood is kind of disgraced. Johnston comes back. Anecdotally, it's kind of funny because at that time, as you can imagine, there's like a massive amount of people who are or soldiers who are beginning to desert. And so one of the things that a lot of the NCOs would do was kind of promise them, like, oh, you didn't hear Johnston's coming back, even if they had no idea he actually was coming back, because the men loved him that much. He kept them well fed, kept them supplied. They didn't send him out needlessly to be butchered, right? He thought more defensively. So as a grunt, you were pretty happy with that. They fought a series of battles around North Carolina, and they actually held their own for several days against Sherman's forces. President Davis, who was on the run, met with Johnston, and he's trying to just claw at all these loose ends and try to figure out some way of getting things back together. And he even mentions an idea for Johnston to try and press a lot of those old deserters back into the army. And Johnston basically says, like, if they didn't want to fight for us when we were winning, why would they want to fight now? And so the game is basically played. So for these armies, the surrender, where Johnston surrenders to Sherman, is on April 26th, and that happens in North Carolina. And surprisingly, sorry, I hope I'm not taking up too much of your time. Surprisingly, this is after Lincoln's assassination, right? So you have to think about that. But the surrender orders were actually very lenient for the Confederates. They could keep their guns. They just had to go back home, basically. And Grant personally came down to North Carolina to more or less set things straight. And he said, well, they just killed our president. The North is out for blood. You got to be a little bit harder on them. You got to give them the same terms that I gave Lee, which was a little bit more pressing, not by much. But what's interesting, we talk about reconciliation, right? Greatest of enemies, Johnston and Sherman. Johnston remembers Sherman's kindness in that regard, and they become fast friends, surprisingly. And there's a time where Johnston, after the war, is working in Washington, D.C. He doesn't have any kids, but it it was commonplace for him to go visit the Shermans, and the Sherman kids remember Uncle Joe coming over, and they pull out the old battlefield maps,
Oh my gosh.
and they'd go over the tactics, like, if you had done this, what would I have
Oh my
done?
God.
And in fact, they were so fond of each other that Sherman dies first, and he dies on Valentine's Day, surprisingly enough. And Joe Johnson is one of his pallbearers at his funeral. And the story goes that Johnson, of course, is older at this time. This is in the early 1890s. And it's cold day, February, it's raining, and he takes his hat off for Sherman. And some people around him are like, "What are you doing, General? You got to put your hat back on. You're going to get sick." And he says, "No, if the roles were reversed, if I were in the casket and Sherman were here, I know that he would take his hat off for me." And he did get sick. 6 weeks later, he died. So, yeah. Again, that idea of like reconciliation between enemies after all of this. I think that speaks not so much for them particularly, but for us as Americans, right? That we have that gene in us to be able to do that. Yeah, any other questions or anything? Cool. Well, even though it is a beautiful day, I think I've taken up enough of your time. This is now, oh yeah, we're well over. It's about 12:30. So I'm going to head back down towards the parking lot, but I really do appreciate you guys coming out and caring about the history of this place. I know a lot of people come here, they hike quite a bit, which is great. I wonder, you know, what the soldiers would think about, and I think that they would be pretty happy that this is a place of solace and reflection, however you come to understand that, and that it's not an Arby's or a Pizza Hut or something. So, but I appreciate you guys coming out and wanting to learn a little bit about the battle. As you guys know, we have weekend programs every weekend. We've got museum tours almost every day at the visitor center. So if you'd like to know a little bit more about the history of the mountain or various aspects of this campaign, just check in on some of that.
What time is the museum tour today?
So we don't have one today because we have this program, but usually Monday through Friday is at 2:00. So really, the key ones are Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Usually we have some volunteers that like to come in Tuesdays and Thursdays to help out and do those, but at 2:00. Yep. And our big battle anniversary programming is usually at the end of June. So lots of cannon shoots, lots of cool stuff to do with that.
Like reenactment?
I can't say that. We don't do reenactments here. No, we do demonstrations. Yeah. If you want a big Civil War reenactment, they do it up in Resaca every year in May.